Hello, my name is Nisha Scott, and today I will be reviewing Chapter 12 of our text titled Contemporary Views of Leadership in Organizations. So if you go to the next slide, there's an outline. First, we'll get started on introducing the contemporary situational theories. Then we'll be followed by leadership through the eyes of followers. Next, we'll have alternatives to leadership. Then we'll have changing the nature of leadership. Then we'll move on to emerging issues on leadership. And finally, with my own thought-provoking question. So let's just jump right into it. So contemporary situational theories. The first one is the LMX model, which is stressing the importance of variable relationships between the supervisors and each of their subordinates. So that's generally like a general manager and any employees that fall underneath him or her. Next, you have the in-group situational theory. This is often when special duties are required for more responsibility and autonomy. They may also receive special privileges such as more discretion about work schedules. So let's say one particular employee has receives in-group, then that's generally meaning that they're receiving special treatment or like being able to come in late or having a more flexible work schedule, things of that nature. Next, we have the out-group situational theory where it's pretty much the opposite of the in-group, where this person may receive less of the supervisor's time and attention and are likely to be assigned to a more mundane task from the group, or has to like perform something that's not really in the loop, or they're generally missing out on information as pertaining to the group. So that's the difference between in-group and out-group versus the LMX model. Moving on to the next slide, we have leadership through the eyes of followers. First, we have transactional leadership, then we have transformational leadership, followed by charismatic leadership, and then I decided to add on attribution perspective. So let's begin with transactional leadership. This is when leadership is focused on routine, regimented activities, so it's generally like the same thing over and over again. You can kind of already expect what the leader may or may not ask for. With transformational leadership, it's generally a set of abilities that allows the leader to recognize whether or not the group needs to change. That way they can have some innovation to create a vision to guide that change so that they can begin to execute the changes effectively. So transformational leadership is more of like flexibility, open for innovation, willing to make changes in the environment. Moving on to charismatic leadership, this is the influence based on a leader's personal charisma. Some of my personal favorites are John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King, and lately Barack Obama. These are all people whom are generally great speakers. People are drawn to them. Their leadership, their charismatic leadership allows people to sway more towards their opinion, in my own perspective. Now, with attribution perspective, this is when behaviors are observed in a context associated with leadership. This is different from people who may attribute varying levels of leadership ability or power to the person displaying those behaviors. So I decided to add that in because that is still a leadership attribution through followers. Next slide. Now we have alternatives to leadership. We have leadership substitutes and then leadership neutralizers. Leadership substitutes are when an individual task and organizational characteristics, they tend to outweigh the leader's ability to affect like the subordinate satisfaction and performance. With leadership neutralizers, these are generally factors that render ineffective as a leader's attempts to engage in various leadership behaviors. So you see how they're very much different. One outweighs the leader's ability to affect the subordinate's work performance versus factors that make the leader ineffective. Next slide. Now we have changing the nature of leadership. There are 5 different ways to change the nature of leadership. First, we have charismatic/value-based leadership. Then we have team-oriented leadership. Then we have participative leadership, humane-oriented leadership, autonomous leadership, and self-protective leadership. So charismatic value-based leadership is basically the ability to inspire, to motivate, to promote high performance from employees or the group. It's usually a very self-sacrificing, trustworthy, very decisive type of leader. They're probably performance-oriented. With a team-oriented leader, this person emphasizes on team building and creating that like common purpose, common goal. Really big on collaborating and being diplomatic, wanting to include everyone so that they can see how their work aligns with the overall group goal. Participative leadership is pretty much the extent to which the leaders will involve everyone else in that decision-making process. So it's really about being, participative and like non-autocratic. With humane-oriented leadership, it's more about that support, being considerate and compassionate, generous, always displaying empathy and modesty, being sensitive to everybody's wants and needs within that group. Autonomous leadership, this is pretty much referring to the independent and individualist, basically out for self, very autonomous, very unique. Pretty much, I have my goals, you guys have your goals. Let's just focus on what our separate goals are. And lastly, with self-protective leadership, this is when behaviors essentially they ensure the safety and security of the leader and only the leader. It's generally more self-centered, this type of leadership will lead to conflict, and it's usually the leader will generally try to save face or may even blame others for mistakes that happen or mishaps that happen throughout the project or throughout any mishaps for reaching the goal. I think this is probably the most detrimental nature of leadership, because being out for self in a team, it's never effective. One of my favorites is actually charismatic, value-based leadership, because I think instilling inspiration in your team is one of the most important parts of being a leader. So as long as you're promoting high performance and like you're being that visionary, people will trust you and you'll get better results from everyone involved. Next slide. So as I said before, charismatic leadership is one of my favorite leadership styles. So some of the 3 factors of being a charismatic leader is envisioning, energizing, and enabling. So with envisioning, it's really about articulating a compelling vision, setting those high expectations, modeling consistent behaviors. Then with energizing, it's more of like demonstrating personal excitement, expressing personal confidence, finding different ways to achieve that success, reaching that goal. Enabling, which means like making sure people in the team know that you're expressing personal support, you're empathizing with them, you are instilling confidence within them so that they know you trust them to execute and they will believe in you as a leader. Next slide. Changing the nature of leadership. So here we have 3 breakdowns of how to change the natures of leadership, especially in today's society. So you can have leaders as coaches, gender and leadership, and then cross-cultural leadership. So the nature of leadership and leaders as coaches are essentially leaders who are increasingly being called upon to serve as coaches rather than supervisors. For example, in our text, there was a football coach giving directions to his players so that they could facilitate the work of those players rather than supervising and micromanaging, controlling their performance. I think that's a pretty mentory way of projecting leadership, which is effective depending upon the person. Next, we have gender and leadership. There is a growing number of women coming into leadership roles, given that most of these leadership theories and research have focused mostly on male leaders. Now we're like moving more towards developing a better understanding of how females lead, and that's definitely an important step because this is going to change the dynamic of future roles as the time goes on. And lastly, we have cross-cultural leadership, which is essentially shaping the company culture. So there's always going to be a difference in race, religion, location, how people grew up, whatever their background is, that is going to be that cross-cultural leadership. So understanding the differences in people and the different things that they can bring to the table is essential and vital to having a successful cross-cultural leadership. Next slide. So now we have emerging issues in leadership. There's ethical, virtual, and strategic leadership. With ethical leadership, this is basically the process of leading based on like constant principles and ethical behavior, your morals, your values. Virtual leadership is essentially various forms of leading through distance and technology. So let's say if someone is working from home, and their supervisor is trying to communicate something to them. Learning those tactical ways to communicate with employees within your organization is going to be essential, because quite often relying on emails can be misconstrued, and with misconstrued comes a whole other dynamic. With strategic leadership, this is essentially understanding the complexities of both the organization and the environment, and what changes can bring change to that organization. So essentially, you're maintaining a superior alignment between the organization and the environment. I think the biggest one out of all three of these would probably be virtual leadership, as there are a lot of roles today where you can work from home or you can work remotely. So with that, you have to really be tactical in the way you communicate with your employees, especially as a leader, because you can have ethical leadership, but if you're communicating something that someone is taking in a negative light based off of an email, then that kind of goes out the window, as does strategy. So virtual leadership will probably be the most emerging factor over the next few years. So researchers should probably build upon that so that we can have more research as time goes on. Here are some tips on virtual leadership, some do's. Being careful when writing emails and messages. As I stated before, they can be misconstrued, especially with firing an employee or reprimanding an employee via email. No one knows the actual delivery. It's really cut and dry with email, so you really want to be careful with that. So do be careful. Next, always supplement emails with a face-to-face interaction. So let's say if you are working remotely and you aren't able to get in touch with that employee, then maybe you should follow up with a video call or a FaceTime, or setting up for you guys to meet somewhere face-to-face, so that those messages can be communicated correctly. And lastly, holding conversations regarding the employee's work performance confidential, because that is probably the most vital thing to do as a leader in an organization. Whatever that person's business is, it should remain between you and that person. Here's some don'ts. Don't use emails to fire employees or deliver bad news. Do not use emails to discuss an employee's performance with other managers, essentially gossiping, because it's not really anyone else's business what he or she is doing. Next slide. So here's the thought-provoking question I wanted to ask. How important is charisma for people? Well, how important is charisma for someone to lead a team or group of people? As I stated before, charisma is one of my leadership tactics. I go based pretty much off of personality, and I'm able to sway others into seeing my vision, being that visionary. I give positive feedback when I am in a team environment. So how important is charisma for you in your leadership? What do you look for? Is it that important of a factor? And does charisma enable people to agree or disagree more with someone who is well-liked, and how? And lastly, we have the reference slide, where you can take a look at some of the research that I use to convey this message. Thank you. Good night.